So you orient yourself towards some good, the highest good that you can conceptualize, and it has to be through a consultation with your ancestors, because you need to do the things that people have always done, and you need to do them properly, and you need to assume that that's the way that you should live, unless you have a very good reason to change it dramatically, and maybe you do, but you got to start with some axiomatic set of presuppositions, because otherwise you have to invent everything on your own, and you don't have enough time to do that. So you have to use normative guidelines. And if you don't, then people won't know what to do with you. That's another big problem. If you live completely outside the norm. I mean, you know, remarkable artists manage that to some degree. But of course they pay for the privilege by being remarkable artists. So if there's something truly remarkable about you, perhaps you could justify deviating from the normative path. But if there isn't, first of all, there's nothing remarkable enough about you to justify deviating in every way from the normative path, no matter how remarkable you are. So that's part of the rescuing of the father from the depths, is to reunite yourself with the traditional structures of your community. You can do that in a way that you feel suits your own needs best. But I don't think you can not do it, because it makes you weak. And then you'll drown. All right, so let's say you have oriented yourself, but not perfectly, because you're full of mistakes and errors. So then what do you do? Because you have to fix those errors, but you still have to be oriented. And this is why I started to get interested in the phenomena of meaning as a phenomenological experience, to experience something as meaningful. It's not exactly obvious what that means, to experience something as meaningful. I think that you can approach it obliquely, you know, like if I said, watch yourself for 2 weeks and notice when you're doing something that you regard as meaningful. I could say, well, here's some markers. You lose a sense of time, you lose a sense of vulnerability, you're deeply engaged in it. It seems worth the effort, right? You forget yourself while you're doing it. Maybe you forget your existential concerns while you're doing it. You're not ruminating or obsessing about the meaning of your life. Right? So there's markers for it. It's like the flow states that Csikszentmihalyi described. And then you can experience it under certain sort of ritualistic conditions. You might experience it when you go see a great movie. You might experience it when you listen to music. I think music is a very, very standard pathway for people to have that kind of experience, because virtually everyone gets intimations of meaning from music. And I think music is hierarchically structured patterns that are representative of being laying itself out properly. It's something like that. So it's an abstract representation of proper being. And so we can grapple with the phenomena of music, and we can box, or phenomena of meaning, we can box it in a little bit and start to conceptualize it. We can start to conceptualize it perhaps as the manifestation of a deep instinct. And so I would say, well, meaning is what manifests itself when you've oriented yourself properly, and when you've optimized the flow of information between you and chaos. That might be the right way of thinking about it. Because you think about a piece of music, is you want it to be predictable, but you don't want it to be perfectly predictable. You want it to be predictable with some interesting variations, and predictable with some variations that make sense. And maybe you can conceptualize that as something like this. It's like, it's predictable at this order of stability, but it's varying down here from time to time. And so you've got stability there, but variability there, and you can handle that. So you want an overarching structure of stability with some internal variability. And maybe that's the way that you update yourself without falling apart. And then I would say you can find the pathway to the optimal rate of update by relying on your sense of meaning. That's what it's for. What it tells you is that you're wandering your way through the world between the catastrophes of chaos and the catastrophes of order, and now and then you swing into the proper locale. You're where you should be. And what happens is you get engaged by that. You get meaningfully engaged by that. And it's fragile. It'll move on you, right? Because it's very difficult to exist at that point constantly. Your bad habits all sorts of things, your situation, there's all sorts of things that are going to interfere with that. But that doesn't mean that that isn't where you should be. And so then you might say, well, that's where you should strive to be all the time. And then the question might be, well, what would it be like if you were there all the time? And I think that's where intimations of paradise come from. I mean, when I think it was Wordsworth talked about intimations of immortality in childhood, people tend to romanticize their childhood because of the sense of intense engagement that goes along with being a child. And it's one of the wonderful things about being around children, actually. They pay you for their care. And the way that children pay you for their care is that they turn normal things into magic again when you're around them, because you've seen it 100 times before. And so when you see it, you don't see it. You see what you already know. But when a child sees it, they don't, because they don't know. They see it, and then when you watch them see it, you see it too. And so it's tremendous fun leading a small child around to do things that you've done before, because they're so, they're like this. They're like all the time, and maybe that's too much, and they cry and they get upset and all of that, but a good part of the time it's just wild-eyed wonder, and then you can see the world through their eyes, and it's payment. And so that sense of being engaged like that is something that people love about children, and rightly so. But it's also a marker to the proper way of being. There's a dictum this is a Jungian idea, that there's no difference between the archetype of the wise old man and the archetype of the child. They're the same thing. Because the wise old man is the person who found what he had in childhood but lost. Right? That's a very powerful motif, is that the purpose of maturation is to return to the state of childhood as a mature being. Not to stay in the state of childhood. That's Peter Pan. But to make the sacrifices necessary for maturation and then return. You say, well, how do you do that? Well, you do that in part by noting what it is that's meaningful for you to engage in. I would say it's your nervous system reporting to you. Right hemisphere and left hemisphere balanced. The balance between chaos and order produces an output that says you are in the right place. It's a perception. The meaning is a perception of being in the right place. It's the genuine thing. However, because it can be pathologized, that's the thing, and that's why I think there's a call to virtue in most great religious traditions. If you're going to rely on your sense of meaning to orient you, you have to play a straight game, because otherwise you warp and twist the inputs, and then the mechanism won't function properly. It's like if you've blinded yourself to half the world, you can't use your perceptions to orient yourself properly, because the half of the world that you're ignoring is going to pop up at you unexpectedly and take you down. And so if your relationship with the world isn't pristine, honest primarily, then you can't rely on your own internal orienting mechanisms. And then you either fall into chaos, which is an absolute catastrophe, or you have to rely on some kind of external authority. And that makes you prone to possession by tyrannical ideologies, for example, which give you that sense of meaning that you should in fact have as a consequence of your own action.
So, sorry, bear with me, because I'm going to try to word this question as best as I can. But, okay, so if all relationships are sort of predicated on this balance between no conflict and conflict that destructs, then if we were to look at this at a more macro level, we see this sort of manifest in history in our world, like with conflict in between countries, in between systems, ideology, etc. But wouldn't this sort of navigation between the exact line of no conflict versus conflict, how does that not imply that some people are inherently doomed to chaos?
It might imply that. One of the things, so sometimes you don't have an answer that works. You have an answer that produces the highest probability of success. And like, I could view the archetypal world from a religious perspective and say that there's such a thing as ultimate and final redemption. That's a metaphysical claim. I don't want to do that. I think it's independent of what I'm talking about. What I'm saying is that there's an archetypal path that's laid out in the mythology of the hero, and it's your best bet. That's all. It's your best bet. It doesn't mean that if you apply it, that everything is going to turn out the way you might want it to turn out. But I would say this, there's a way there's an interesting twist on that too. This is one of the things that I came to understand about trying to speak the truth, is that you can make an assumption, you can make a fundamental assumption based on your ignorance, let's say, and the ineradicable quality of your ignorance, that you can't compute the best possible outcome. What you can do instead is make a decision, and one decision is, well, I'm going to say what I think and see what happens. And then you can define that as the best possible outcome. Now you might say, well, now and then that's going to lead you into chaos. It's like, yeah, it is. It is. It's a strange inversion. But regardless of all that, I would still say human beings are finite and limited and mortal, you know, and death is final, let's say. I'm not saying that, but we could easily say that. Doesn't matter. This is still the best pathway forward. It isn't certainty. There's no certainty. And it's very frequently in life you have poison A or poison B. Like, you get to pick your poison. You don't get to pick the elixir of life. But I would also say I don't think there's any reason to be particularly pessimistic, because we don't know what would happen if people really tried hard to get their acts together. Like, if they understood the necessity of that and really put it forward. I mean, I've had lots of experience with my clinical clients now. You know, I've seen dozens and dozens of people, and we have tried jointly to get their lives straighter, and it works almost inevitably. Now, that doesn't mean I've had clients who died. You know, we were 3/4 through a wonderful process of psychological renovation, and they got cancer and died. So there's no certainty associated with this, but it's the best solution available. And it's also possible that it's a good enough solution. You know, I was talking to my class yesterday about this, you know, so if you pursue the things in your life that are meaningful, once you've oriented yourself, and that means accepting the challenges that come along with that, because one of the things that you'll find, you even find this in music, if you know a piece of music completely, then you tend not to want to listen to it anymore. There still has to be some challenge in it. You still have to track it, and sometimes music is so complex you just can't. It just sounds like noise. Modern music is often like that because it's so, well, it tends towards the chaotic, and so I find it difficult to listen to because I can't get a handle on it. But then, you know, so it's too challenging, and then there's other music. Pop music is often like this. It's catchy the first 2 times you hear it, and then you never want to hear it again. It's too much, there's too much predictability and not enough chaos. And hopefully you find a piece of music that's somewhere in the middle. You can listen to it 50 or 100 times, and each time you listen to it, there's still some new nuance in it that you didn't expect before. And so, well, you kind of want to set up your life like that, so that, and I think you see that the phenomena of meaning manifests itself at the area, at the locale of optimal challenge. So one of the things, for example, I might say, well, let's say you want to set some goals for yourself. We say, well, they're remarkable goals, but they're too unattainable. You're just going to find it frustrating to pursue them. It's going to be too punishing. And then we might say, well, here's a goal, and you think, well, I could do that, you know, standing on my head. There's no challenge in it. Well, both of those two extremes are going to leave you in a state that isn't characterized by the optimization of engagement and meaning. One is too difficult, it's too punishing, it's the judge and nothing else, and the other is the ultimate and merciful mothers. It's like you win no matter how you play. So then you calibrate it. You say, well, you know, I'm up for a challenge at this level. I wouldn't recommend that, because that's just a bit like people do that. You might want to investigate your character in detail and decide, you know, what's going on at this level of analysis. That's pretty harsh, but you can certainly continually retool yourself at more micro levels, and I think what you do is you pick the level of retooling that optimizes your willingness to be engaged in it. And then what's so interesting about that is that, I think, is that you get the benefits of perfection, so to speak, while still being imperfect. Your actual imperfection has nothing to do with it. What's relevant is the journey that you're undertaking to rectify the imperfection. So instead of aiming to be the entity without flaws, you're aiming to be the entity that continues to realize its flaws and overcome them. Well, that's a game you can play forever. And that's maybe the ultimate in being an unflawed entity. It's something like that. So I want to show you some pictures that I think are associated with that. So this one, to begin with, this is an absolutely amazing picture, I think. So this is Berthold Furtmeyer, Tree of Life flanked by Eve and Mary Ecclesia. And this, in some sense, this picture summarizes the biblical stories in one picture, which is, that's pretty amazing that a picture can do that. And so let me explain the picture a little bit. So the first thing you see here is that this is the tree of life. And so it echoes the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But this is post-fall. So we interpreted the story of Adam and Eve already, is that human beings became self-conscious. They discovered death. They discovered morality. It was all a consequence of interacting with the fruit and the snake, something like that. And you can read that as an evolutionary tale. You can at least read it as a representation of the emergence of self-consciousness in human beings. And so what does that mean? Well, it means that the apple, in some sense, was equivalent to death. And that's what you see here. You see Eve is picking fruit from the tree here. But the fruit it's on the skull side of the tree. And so Eve, it's the vulnerability of Eve. She's naked there and displayed to the world. It's the vulnerability of Eve. That's one way of thinking about it. It was the vulnerability of Eve that was the catalyst to the development of human self-consciousn's. And I think that that's true. It seems to be a reasonable proposition. And so Eve's relationship with the fruit and the snake doomed human beings to the realization of mortality. That's what this side of the picture represents. And so it's a catastrophe, and it's associated here with the snake and the fruit. It's human beings' attempts to understand how it is that they emerged into a self-conscious world. Okay, so fine. So this is on the fall end of the story, and this is on the solution end of the story. Now what you see here, there's a skull there, and there's a crucifix here. And you see there's all these little fruits on this tree. So it's the apple of death that Eve is handing out on this side, and it's the host that plays a role in the cannibalistic rite that's at the center of Christian ritual, that Mary, as the church, is handing out as a medication for this. So she's handing out the antidote. Well, what's the antidote? Well, it's a strange thing. It's associated with this crucifix. And that's translated into this wheaten host. So you're supposed to eat that, and that is the incorporation of whatever this represents. Well, the question then is, what does that represent? It's a symbol of suffering, obviously. It's a symbol of the ultimate in suffering. It's the weirdest thing, because the picture proposes that to ingest the ultimate in suffering is to simultaneously ingest the antidote to the catastrophe of the knowledge of death. It's a very strange paradox, but it's the proper paradox that's at the center of the great drama that's represented by this picture. A little knowledge of death destroys you. Full voluntary acceptance of it is the cure. That's the idea. Well, that's a hell of an idea. It's not only to accept it is simultaneously, in some sense, to take responsibility for it. Because you don't take responsibility for things that you don't accept. You only take responsibility for things that you do accept. You say, well, the world is fundamentally flawed because its fundamental nature is vulnerability, intolerable vulnerability. I'm not going to take any responsibility for that. That's really Cain's attitude in the story of Cain and Abel. He externalizes responsibility for the catastrophe of his life. And therefore he doesn't make the right sacrifices. And so the paradoxical injunction here is accept responsibility for the catastrophe of your life. And that way you transcend it simultaneously. And there's an unbelievably hopeful message in there. And the message is, you're actually strong enough to do that. You just don't know it. And you won't find out till you do it. You can't find out till you do it. But if you did it, you'd find out that it was true. It's a massive risk. It's the ultimate in risks, right? You have to be willing to lose your life in order to find it. It's like, exactly right. So that picture, when I started to understand that picture, well, every time I look at it, it just blows me away. I can't, it's unbelievably, it's an unbelievably sophisticated set of ideas. But I don't think it's much different, really, than this idea. I mean, Buddha finds his enlightenment under a tree. It's not fluke that that's the case. That's his natural environment. And he's sitting in the lotus here. The lotus opens up. It's this thing that springs up from the depths. And he sits there illuminated the same way. He's got a halo that's the sun that stands for higher consciousness. And he's transcended by accepting the fact that life is suffering. He's transcended the limitations that are part of mortality. You see that symbol there? That swastika, you see it there? It's reversed. The Nazis reversed it. Well, think about that. I mean, they weren't stupid. Their symbolism, their symbols had meaning. Is what the swastika represented was what this represents reversed. Well, that's a very bad idea. This is the thing that this idea is what enables people to transcend their suffering. And Buddha said, well, don't be too attached to things. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean deny the world. It might mean deny the world if you're too in love with the material, like with material well-being, let's say, then your pathway to transcendence and meaning might be to abandon that because it's constraining you. It's making you less than you could be. But the fundamental lesson, the more fundamental lesson that's underneath that is don't let what you are stop you from being what you could be. Right. And so then the question is, well, what do you identify with? Do you identify with what you are? Then you're a tyrant. Do you identify with chaos? Because that's the opposite of order, say. Then you're nihilistic. Well, you don't identify with either of those. You know that they're both necessary. You know that you have to live with both of them. But you identify with the capacity to continually transcend what you are. And then you seek out error. That's what humility is. It's like, I'm error-ridden. It's like, so I want to put myself in a situation where I can discover one of my errors, hopefully not in a way that's going to knock me completely out of the game, right? I want to seek out a challenge. I want to find out where my limits are. I want to find out where there's not enough of me yet. And I want to do that in a way that's engaging because, you know, you can wear yourself out fighting dragons, obviously. You can exhaust yourself completely, and that's not helpful. You know, one of the things I learned, for example, when I was coaching lawyers, these were people who had very high-end careers, and so they had an infinite workload. No matter how much they worked, flat out, there was always way more work that they should do. It's a very difficult thing to learn to manage. And so they were exhausting themselves, and I said, well, you know, you have to work less per day. It's like, well, no, that's not happening. I can't do that. And so what I learned over time was, okay, so this is what you have to do. Every 3 months you have to block off 4 days and go have a vacation. And you have to plan that in advance so it's in your calendar so that your secretary doesn't book your time. And then you need that because you have to recuperate enough so that you can work as hard as you're going to work. And of course they were nervous about that. And I said, well, look, we can calibrate this. Let's keep track of your billable hours over the next year and see if they increase or decrease. Because I bet you if you take more time off, you'll actually have more billable hours. You'll actually have your cake and eat it too. You'll get to have a vacation and you'll be more productive. And that inevitably, that was what happened. And so that's a matter of calibrating the game properly, right? You want to play a game that you can play today, but also one that you can play next week and next month. We're not talking about, you know, your career this week. We're talking about you having a career that lasts 30 years, that doesn't kill you, that doesn't make you hate yourself or the job, that doesn't make you bitter, that doesn't wear you to a frazzle. So it has to be optimized. And so I think that you can, in fact, decide to take on the load that's optimally meaningful if you want, and then you get to have your cake and eat it too. You're on the pathway to continual incremental improvement. You only have to burn off a feather at a time instead of having the whole bloody thing burst into flames. But it's a constant source of renewal. And there's an idea that to be renewed, you have to drink the water of life, right? That's an old mythological idea. And what's the water? The water of life, chaos is water. Water is chaos. Water is what washes away too much order. And to stay continually, let's say, refreshed by the water of life is to take on exactly the right amount of chaos to make sure that your garden is properly nourished. And I think meaning is actually the marker of that. And as I said, you know that I wouldn't consider myself either naive or particularly optimistic person. I don't think I'm either of those. But this is actually an idea, this is one of the only ideas that I've ever found that I really believe to be rock solid. I actually think that it's true. And it's very optimistic because it says you can use your sense of meaning to calibrate your progress through life. But there's rules. You have to aim at the highest possible good that you can conceive. Now, and that's subject to update because what the hell do you know? But you start by aiming at the star you can see rather than the dimmer one that you can't yet perceive. And then you decide that you're going to do that honestly, right? That's a big decision. So the first decision, I think, in some sense is a decision of love. You're going to decide that being is worthwhile and that you're going to work for its betterment. And that's a decision that's based on love. And the second decision is based on truth. Having made that decision, you're going to play a straight game. Having made those two decisions, I think that you can allow your sense of meaning to calibrate your pathway. And then what's so interesting is that you hit a state that's as close to paradisal as you're going to hit right away, because being engaged like that, it's better to be engaged in the solution of a complex problem than not to have a problem at all. And that's no different than saying it's better for there to be being than non-being, because being is a problem. And so if you want to have no problems, then you have no being. And you could say, well, being is so miserable that maybe that's the route we should take. And fair enough, but maybe you can have your cake and eat it too. You can have the damn problem. It can be a problem worth solving, and you can be so engaged in solving the problem that it justifies the fact that the problem exists. And then you get to have the problem and the solution at the same time, and maybe that's better than not having the problem at all. And I believe that, because one of the things I have seen, and I've seen this being so interesting when I've been lecturing to people, especially more recently, and this has also manifested itself on YouTube. I'm talking to people a lot about responsibility, and it's young men in particular that seem to be responding to that. And I think that's partly because I think that young women, in some sense, have their responsibility map already laid out for them. It's also less voluntary in some sense for women because they have more complicated problems to solve in the first part of their life, right? Because they have to get the family problem solved. But whatever. I've been talking in a very delineated manner about responsibility, which is a strange thing to sell to people, but responsibility is what gives your life meaning. And so then you might say, well, then take on ultimate responsibility. And what happens? You have an ultimately meaningful life. And then you might say, well, if your life is ultimately meaningful, it doesn't matter if it's punctuated by tragedy or even predicated on tragedy. It's worth it. And I think that's true. And everything I've seen indicates to me that's true. Every time I get my clients to take on more responsibility, and it isn't an injunction. You're a bad person, you should take on responsibility. It has nothing to do with that. You can define the damn responsibility. It isn't something that someone else should impose on you. It's not a matter of doing what you should do in some abstract manner. It's not that. It's the choice of what game you're going to play. And you can play the game of the seeker, I would say, and if you play that game, then everyone wins. And it's the best game you can play. And so the answer, in some sense, to the tragedy of life, to the catastrophe of life, to the fall, is to adopt the responsibility of mortality that goes along with that, and to play that game maximally. And paradoxically, it's in the willingness to do that the solution emerges. And I have done my best with every single thing I've talked to you guys about. I have done my best to do what Dostoevsky does in his novels, which is I make a proposition and then I spend months or years trying to figure out if I can take the bloody thing apart, if there's something wrong with it, because I want to find out. I want to hit it with a hammer and see if it breaks. And what I've been trying to do is to tell you all the things that I've gathered, let's say, or laid out or articulated or discovered over the last 30 years that I have not been able to break with the biggest hammer that I could take to them. And I guess that's the fundamental one, is that I believe that the idea that lurks in these images, derived from very different cultures, it's the same idea. Life is suffering. Right. Indisputable. What do you do about that? You voluntarily accept it and then strive to overcome the suffering that's a consequence of that. And you do that for you, and you do that in a way that makes it better for other people. And then that works. And one question might be, well, how well does it work? And the answer is, the only way that you can find out is by trying it. That's it. That's the existential element of it. The proof is to be derived by the incarnation of the attitude in your own life. No one can tell you how it will work for you. It's the thing that your destiny is to discover that. And you have to make the decisions to begin with. It's like, because you can't do this without commitment. You have to commit to it first. That's the act of faith that Kierkegaard was so insistent upon. You have to say, I'm going to act as if being is good. I'm going to act as if truth is the pathway to enlightenment. I'm going to act as if I should pursue the deepest meaning possible in my life. And there's reasons to do none of those. They're real reasons. So it's really a decision. But you can't find out what the consequence of the decision is unless you make the decision. I think the same thing happens when you get married, by the way. So if you think you might leave, you're not married. And then you think, well, the marriage didn't succeed. It's like, well, maybe you were never married. Because the rule is, you don't get to leave. And there's a reason for that rule. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't situations where there should be exceptions made for that. That's not the point. The point is that there's some games you don't get to play unless you're all in. And the other thing that's so interesting about being alive is that you're all in. No matter what you do, you're all in. This is going to kill you. So I think you might as well play the most magnificent game you can while you're waiting. Because do you have anything better to do? Really? Why not pick the best thing possible that you could do? Why not do that? Maybe you could justify your wretched existence to yourself that way. I think you could. That's what it looks like. You know, people find such meaning in the responsibilities they adopt, it stops making them ask questions about what life is for. If you have a newborn child, for example, like unless you're really in a bad way, psychotically depressed, or maybe your personality really needs some retooling, you stop thinking about anything but ensuring that that baby is doing well. And if someone comes along and asks you an existential question about your commitment to that, the right response is, why are you asking me such stupid questions when this is manifesting itself right in front of your eyes? Like, how blind can you be? That isn't a time for questions about the meaning of life. The answer is right in front of you. And if you can't see it, it's not because life has no meaning, it's because you're blind. I mean, that's what the image of the Virgin Mother and the child is all about. It's like, what's the answer to the meaning of life? Here's an answer. It's like, well, I'm going to criticize that. Well, go right ahead. You know, it's like what you're like a what do you call that? A termite gnawing on a temple. There's no utility in that sort of criticism. It's blindness. And it's the same thing with regards to the path of the hero. It's like it glistens in front of you and you can criticize it. It's like, fine. Put the cart before the horse and see how far you get. So I thought, to bring full closure to the class, I was trying to solve this terrible puzzle that confronted me and many other people about how it was that human beings got themselves in such a tangle about what they believed. Such a tangle that we were pointing the ultimate weapons of destruction at one another, which, by the way, we are still doing. And I thought, okay, well, I understand that. We need our belief systems. They orient us. And that means there will be conflict between belief systems, and that can be a catastrophe. And that's being played out everywhere, again, in very many ways. What's the solution to that? Well, one possibility is there's no solution. It's just mayhem all the way around. Could be the case. But it seemed to me, as I delved into it, that the proper solution to that was to live properly as an individual, because you're more powerful than you think. Way more powerful than you think. I mean, God only knows what you are in the final analysis. You're blind to your own weaknesses, but you're also blind to your own strengths. And so then I think, well, if you got your act together, it'd be better for you, and instantly it would be better for your family, assuming they wanted you to get your act together, and not everyone does, and then it would be better for the community. It's like, how far could you take that? If you stopped wasting time, and if you stopped lying, and if you oriented yourself to the highest possible good that you could conceive of, and you committed to that, how much good could you do? Well, I would say, why don't you find out?